Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for coming. This is the 10th edition of our monthly webinar series, India and Asia. Series aims to unpack India's changing position as a rising power in Asia. In particular, it asks what kind of constructive roles can India play in the region, and how do various countries in the region view India's rise. So we have so far discussed India's relations with Maldives, with Philippines, with Japan, Middle East, Malaysia, UAE, and India-ASEAN economic and political relations, and India-US strategic partnership in Indo-Pacific. And today we are here to unpack India's Eastern maritime strategy, particularly its approach to the Bay of Bengal and Andaman Sea. India's approach to maritime security has come into limelight recently, not in the least because the Sino-Indian rivalry in Indonesia, in the Indo-Indian Ocean has been heating up. In the last few years, India has launched a very ambitious fleet modernization program. It has also undertaken very extensive indigenization efforts. Since 2020, the capital expenditure for the Indian Navy has really substantially jumped and has stayed high. It has also embarked on the somewhat controversial development of the Great Nicobar Island as a commercial port and as a strategic outpost. And it's also pursuing some very creative ways of defense diplomacy, not in the least the Indian Ocean ship saga that it launched last year. With all these changes afoot, I thought it would be good for us to try to understand how India's maritime strategy in the East is evolving. And I'm also hoping to I'm also hoping that we could a little bit discuss the geographical construction, or the geographical way in which the maritime strategy of India is distributed. To be a bit provocative, there is an old argument that Indian naval approach has historically weighted west, focused much more towards the Middle East and Pakistan. And now, with this year, the ongoing war in Iran, there is a lot of concern that India's focus will be pulled towards the west and away from the east. And I'm hoping that in today's discussion we can touch upon that and other issues. So to discuss all these questions, we are very lucky that we have with us Commander Abhijit Singh. He is a retired Indian Naval officer. He was the head of the Maritime Policy Initiative of ORF, Observer Research Foundation, New Delhi. He not only has extensive command experience, he was also involved in writing of the India's maritime strategy in 2007. He is a regular commentator on maritime matters, writes in several newspapers and Indian media outlets, and I have learned a lot from his writing. In 2010, he also assisted in writing of the third volume of Indian naval history. He has edited two books on India's maritime security, Indian Ocean Challenges, A Quest for Cooperative Solutions, and Geopolitics of Indo-Pacific. He has also published several papers. So we are really grateful that you could take out time to speak to us today. Commander Abhijit Singh, and over to you.
Thank you, Sandeep. At the outset, I'd like to say that I'm fortunate today to be speaking on a subject that has, as you said, has been much in the news lately, but also one that evokes a fair amount of interest in Southeast Asia. When we last met here in New Delhi and we had this wide-ranging conversation on many maritime issues, that is the time that I realized that there was a fair deal of curiosity in Southeast Asia about India's what you call the Eastern Maritime Strategy. And when I look at East, you have qualified this as being the Bay of Bengal, but I also think that the South China Sea, the Western Pacific, very much is part of India's Eastern conception. And therefore, I think the interest in Southeast Asia is not just on account of what India is doing in the region or what the Indian Navy is doing in the region, but also what it has consciously chosen not to do. And so these are some of the issues that I am will look to cover in my remarks. Let me begin upfront by stating that the expression Eastern Maritime Strategy, although it is a very useful shorthand, and also, an apt title for the session today. But really, analytically speaking, it's a bit of a conceptual misnomer. The fact is that nations don't conceive maritime strategy in compartments. Strategy as much as it is a comprehensive set of policies and approaches in the maritime domain that impact national interest, is really a singular framework comprehensive framework. And within the overarching framework of maritime strategy, there certainly are subsets. Each of them may differ from each other. The East may differ from the West and the South, but they all come together to push the same national interests. So maritime strategy, as I said, must be understood, as I said, holistically. Now, a good way to assess India's Eastern approach really is to look at the evolution of Indian maritime thought. I think that's the most important component, if only to understand how our strategic thinking, shifted over a period of time, that we began to look beyond the Eastern Eastern Indian Ocean, or call it the Indian Ocean, towards the South China Sea, and also began to assess our interests in that space. So India released its first maritime strategy document in 2007. And the context is important. It was called Freedom to Use the Seas. And the defining proposition in that strategy was that the economy was developing. India was growing at a very fast pace, and therefore we needed somehow to a plan or a strategy to safeguard the sea lines of communication. But what I found very interesting, and I was part of the team that had worked on that document, was that it actually went beyond that. What the strategy actually said was that while India did have a responsibility to protect commerce, what was important is that it was important for the Indian Navy to have a holistic conception of maritime security, and also look at constabulary challenges, diplomatic outreach, benign challenges, HADR, all of that. And for the first time, we had a situation in which the military component of maritime security was put at nearly at par with the rest of the other roles. That meant that the Indian Navy saw itself as really more than just an instrument of war. We were ambassadors. We were diplomats that needed to go abroad and advance Indian interests. So whilst all of that talk in that maritime strategy, amidst all of the talk of deterrence and sea control and sea denial, the fact also was that we were talking about how to use the seas in order to protect human lives. This was also to a degree driven by the tsunami in 2004 and the cooperation that the Indian Navy had to do with a number of other countries, the US, Australia, Japan. They all had pitched in. Indonesia had pitched in. And that is what initially began to shape our holistic sort of approach to maritime security towards the East. Now, the second document was released in 2015, 8 years later from the first. And the context by then had shifted somewhat. The 2008 Mumbai attacks had happened, and that had shaken Indian maritime planners. There was a sense that there were many coastal gaps that we had, in a manner of speaking, overlooked. And so a lot of what that strategy said was actually to plug those coastal gaps and to have better communication, to have better maritime domain awareness, to link up with our partners, to have more information about what non-state actors are doing in this region. A lot of focus in that strategy was on gray zone warfare, meaning, non-traditional threats, non-state actors acting almost with the capability of state actors. So these were essentially irregular threats that mimicked regular threats. And the sense that one got from that strategy was that that we needed to develop a plan to fight these hybrid actors or these gray zone actors in the maritime domain. My reading of the 2015 document that I read quite carefully, it was I think quite a sophisticated document in that it took the conversation beyond what was being said in 2007, was that it was fundamentally introspective and in large measure a response to what had happened in 2611. I think our primary reaction was that we did not want a repeat of that incident. But that also meant that there was a little bit of a shift from the outward-looking focus that was, in the first strategy, we were actually looking more towards the east and the west. We wanted to do more with our partners, towards a slightly more inward-looking, because we needed now to look at near seas in a really sharp and concerted way. That being said, there was a lot of focus on partnerships. For the first time ever, that strategy spoke of the Indo-Pacific. It spoke of the fact that we needed partnerships and we needed a favorable maritime environment to promote those partnerships and strengthen collaboration with like-minded states in the region. So there was this talk of allocating and pooling resources and greater interoperability, coordinated operations across the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. So if you see, gradually from 2007, we have been looking at the east, in particular the South China Sea, Southeast Asia, as an area of secondary interest, but growing importance for Indian interests there. That is what was important. And now recently we have released a new maritime strategy, the third iteration. And in many respects, it builds upon the foundations of what was said in 2015. I think there is one important difference in what's being said this time, and that will implicate a lot of what we are discussing about the Eastern Maritime Strategy, both in the Andamans and the South China Sea. This particular document brings up the idea of ends, ways, means to achieve our goals. So the ends, means, ways framework essentially means that we've got to look at maritime security in terms of what is doable and ensure that whatever we do in the region is done in a way that our primary interests are protected first. So it acknowledges that now we are in a state of great instability. Geopolitical flux is at a peak. We are in an era of violent peace, as it puts it. It actually has a very interesting formulation. It says that we are in an era of no war, no peace. And what that really means is that a peace that feels like war. This is conditioned, I think, by the 2020 Galwan attacks and what followed after that with China, as also Operation Sindoor with Pakistan. So we had not declared, none of our adversaries or us were formally at war with each other, and yet what happened felt very much like war. So this no war, no peace construct is also interesting because it tells us that the readiness levels within the Indian Navy now are going to be very high, and we know that even a small spark can produce a conflagration, a conflict in our theater of interest. And so alongside the gray zone challenges, which is, maritime terrorism, maritime militias, we now also have some very unstable state actors that are, itching to spread their footprint in an area of interest for India. I think that the whole reference in this strategy to Mahasagar is a new doctrine that expands the earlier Saga doctrine. The Saga doctrine was essentially limited to what India did in the Indian Ocean. And it talked about how we can better cooperate with our partners to expand our stakes and to advance our interests in the Indian Ocean. But now we have this conception of the global South and Indian leadership in the global South. So Mahasagar is a lot about that, and that means that the more we follow the Mahasagar doctrine, we might have a bigger footprint going forward in Southeast Asia. Now, the question really is, if I were, in your audience, that if all of this evolution of Indian maritime thought sounds very nice, but how does this implicate security in the East? What does this have to do with Southeast Asia and South China Sea? Well, I think that there's three ways in which this evolution is directly implicating India's maritime strategy towards the East. First is India's growing recognition, I would say, of partnerships. So if you look at the Act East policy, and if you look at India's neighborhood policy, there is for the first time an acknowledgement that there is an intersection somewhere of both of these policies. We have the BIMSTEC arrangement. We have the outreach to our countries in our neighborhood, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Thailand. That's one part of it. But two of these countries are also members of the ASEAN. So then we have an entire ASEAN outreach. And if you look at our maritime exercises with a lot of countries in the East, Singapore, Vietnam, Indonesia, and now recently the Philippines, there has been a great uptick in what we are doing, a great expansion in terms of what we are doing. These are no longer basic level exercises. We are doing anti-submarine, anti-air, cross-deck landings. We are doing surface firing exercises, particularly with Singapore. So I think we have gone a lot ahead from where we were. A lot of our coordinated patrols that we used to do with our neighboring countries, Indonesia, with Thailand, Myanmar, now we are doing full-fledged exercises with them. So we have upgraded our engagement there also. But more importantly, I would say that it's not just about exercises, it's also about domain awareness, situational awareness, more information sharing. We are doing more with these countries. There is a proposal by the Quad group. It's called the Maritime Surveillance Cooperation, the IPMSC, which upgrades the IPMDA, used to be the Indo-Pacific Maritime Domain Awareness. Now we are going to be pooling our resources to have better surveillance in this region. And a lot of these countries are going to actually benefit from it. It is at the moment focused really on the Indian Ocean, perhaps more on the Bay of Bengal, but in time it's also going to cover some of the countries in Southeast Asia. We are going to have closer linkages with them. Second, I would posit that India's posture in the South China Sea has also evolved. Not to the degree that the media has stated in India. There has been a great deal of, optimism, or I call it irrational enthusiasm about what India is doing in the South China Sea. I wouldn't go so far, but I would say that there definitely has been a movement forward about what we are doing in the South China Sea. Look, for a long time, we said nothing about what was happening with the disputes because it was not a matter that directly concerned us. Or rather, it was not a matter that directly concerned India and New Delhi. But with time, it has become important to take a stand on what's happening in that region. If you look at the India-ASEAN maritime exercise, the first India-ASEAN maritime exercise that happened in 2023, just after that, India makes a statement saying that, regional countries, actually an allusion to China, should abide by UNCLOS regulations. We never said something of this sort. Then, sometime back, Foreign Minister Jaishankar made a statement saying that India supports Philippines' sovereignty claims in the South China Sea. Again, that was a sign to China, signal to China that we were uncomfortable with its coercion in that region, and also a manner of showing solidarity with the Philippines. So again, in the South China Sea, although we are not the Indian Navy does not operate in areas that are disputed. All the same, it does a fair bit of deployments now, and it does bilateral exercises with many of its partners in the region. The most important thing, I think, as far as India's eastern outlook is concerned, actually is capacity building. Be it in the Bay of Bengal with Bangladesh, with Myanmar, Thailand, etc., but more so with countries in Southeast Asia. We now have a robust capacity building outreach. If you just look at the past few years, we have gifted and otherwise also supplied some assets to a number of countries. For example, the INS Kirpan was given to Vietnam in 2020. The submarine INS Sindhuveer was given to Myanmar. So there you have both Bangladesh and Southeast Asia. The BrahMos has now been given to the Philippines. And this is the other aspect. Defense trade is the other aspect that I think that's also an incentive for India to cooperate with these countries, because India's defense trade figures have really been rising rapidly. Last year we did close to 3.2 billion worth of defense trade. So I think in the future, India's defense trade in the region is going to grow, and that's going to be another reason for India to be engaged in this particular space. Now, what wild cards could impact India's strategy in the East? I would say that there's a few things. One, you alluded to in your remarks. Chinese operations in the Indian Ocean, particularly in the Bay of Bengal. I think Chinese operations are more nuanced than many of us imagine. It's not like the Chinese are sending in a lot of warships. At the moment, their aggressive maneuvering is confined to the South China Sea and the Western Pacific. What the Chinese are doing actually is two things. One, they're setting up these dual-use ports. If you look at ports like Gwadar, Hambantota, Shokfu, these are facilities that were primarily built for commercial purposes. But they also happen to possess the physical and structural attributes that could support naval operations. So if there were a conflict, this is a potential naval base or a military base. More importantly, Chinese companies have established a substantial commercial presence in the Bay of Bengal. Look at Bangladesh. It's a prime example. Beijing has significant stakes now in what's happening, all the port building activity, etc., in Chittagong, in Paira Port, and the Mongla Port Special Economic Zone that India was about to actually develop has now been handed over to China. So commercially, industrially, China is much more involved, and it is actually being seen as a development partner by all of these countries, and that complicates India's calculus. The second thing I would say is that these deployment of these Chinese survey vessels and research ships. China does not send too many warships into the Indian Ocean, but it does send these oceanographic vessels, these hydrographic vessels, and these ISR ships, or surveillance and reconnaissance intelligence vessels. So it is worrying from an Indian point of view that these Indian survey vessels have been operating very close to the Andaman Islands. They are reportedly been in a position where they seem to be mapping the seabed and identifying submarine transit routes. Some of these ISR ships have been found very close to Balasore, the Dr. APJ Kalam Island, from where we do our missile testing. And therefore, that means that the Chinese have a robust surveillance program in the Indian Ocean, and that, again, is worrying for us. So why this implicates India's strategy is that the more that Chinese are going to be in this region, and also perhaps in the Arabian Sea, they're going to, of course, exercise with Pakistan, the less India will have the bandwidth to be a presence or a force in Southeast Asia. Finally, I think what worries India the most is Chinese military modernization. It is an issue that every chief of naval staff in the past 10 years has publicly sought to address. If you look at China's aircraft carrier program, they have 3 now, and they have plans to build 4 or perhaps even six more. And they have an expanding fleet of nuclear and attack submarines. So China's modern surface combatants and underwater combatants now are growing at such a rapid pace. Their missile program is developing at such a rapid pace that it's going to be very hard for any of China's competitors to keep up with that sort of modernization and developments. I think India itself has a very robust indigenization plan, and particularly in the past 2 or 3 years, we've had many ships commissioned, a lot of focus on indigenization, Atmanirbhar Bharat. We have this whole vision for 2047. There's the whole Amrit Kal vision. So we want to, or Viksit Bharat vision. So we are trying to push our own indigenization goals, and we are trying to kind of get there, but it's going to be very hard for us to compete with China. Another matter of concern is collusion. This is something that the Chief of Naval Staff talked about. Chinese and Pakistani collusion in the Bay of Bengal. The Pakistanis have recently commissioned a new submarine called the PNS Hangur. It's a Chinese Yuan class submarine, and their senior officers believe that now Pakistan has the reach to be a force in the Bay of Bengal. So going forward, India's east is also going to be could potentially be threatened from Pakistan-China collusion in those waters. There has been a lot of talk about what India is doing in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, particularly this project that has come up, that is coming up in Great Nicobar. This, you rightly said, is a controversial project, and I will look to address that in the Q&A because there's something to be said about that project. But by and large, I believe that India is justified in developing its presence in the Andaman and Nicobar because not only is this a sort of a springboard for Indian naval activity in the region, but India also has a responsibility to protect that littoral, and therefore the development of the bases, the widening and the lengthening of the runways is entirely justified. I would say that one aspect that might complicate India's approach to the region is what's happening with the Iran US war. The fact is that this crisis has continued for too long, and lasting instability in the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea, for that matter, also might distract Indian attention and draw Indian forces westwards. That, again, as I said, leaves little operational strength bandwidth for sustained engagement in Southeast Asia and the wider Indo-Pacific. And India also has an outreach to the Pacific Islands. So, it's not just East doesn't mean they're also doing just stuff with Southeast Asia also there. But I'm going to end by saying this, that uh, uh, despite whatever constraints that India faces in terms of its naval capacity, in terms of its naval reach, which is growing fairly rapidly, and yet it's not as much as the US or perhaps China. India is unlikely to retreat into an Indian Ocean conception. We are going to continue to look at the Indo-Pacific as a theater of operations and a theater of interest. I think the main challenge for New Delhi in the coming decade is going to be not so much expansion, but it's really going to be to convince Southeast Asia that we can be a reliable security provider, or rather, I would say not quite a security provider, but a preferred security partner. This is something that the new maritime doctrine talks about, and the maritime strategy also talks about. That rather than being security providers, we will look at ourselves as a preferred security partner and a first responder. So to be a reliable partner and be able to contribute to the security of that region, even whilst having a lot of our forces deployed west. So you're right, our interests are weighted west because the diaspora is west, the oil comes from the west, the sea lanes, all of our important sea lanes that need to be protected are all in the west. And yet our a geopolitical aspiration, our ambition, our interests are in some ways weighted east. And that we will need to learn to navigate that contradiction. And I think we are doing that quite well. But I'm going to stop here and take more questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent survey, and I know you very rightly said that it doesn't make sense to geographically divide, compartmentalize the naval strategy. But at the same time, I'm glad that the conversation was hinged on East because sometimes it gets lost, that kind of nuance, the geographical nuance of various ways we think about this naval strategy. And I will point out that there is diaspora in Southeast Asia as well, pretty large diaspora. There is supply, there are SLOCs here as well, which are important for Indian trade, of course. I mean, we will open up the discussion for Q&A for the audience, and you can please use the chat box. Anybody can use the chat box or send me a message and I can read out the question. But in the meantime, I have a few questions, and I was hoping to ask you a couple of questions first on China. So, okay. One question I have, and correct, tell me if it is the wrong way of thinking about this, but you basically pointed out that India is expanding its interest and its footprint in the region through more partnership, through expanding geographically, getting involved in South China Sea and all various things that it is doing. What is the primary driver for this expansion on the eastern side, and is it so? Let me put it this way, that historically the reason why India wasn't putting this much effort or this much attention to the east was because it thought that from a security perspective, this area did not really affect Indian security that much, right? So my question is that changing? Is India thinking that actually we need to worry about South China Sea or Southeast Asia because it affects our security? Or is it something of the kind of a tit for tat, that since China is coming into Indian Ocean, China is coming into our neighborhood, we will go into their neighborhood and we'll create some pressure on their side. So it's more of a geopolitical posturing and maneuvering. So which is, or is there a third reason of thinking about, why is this expansion of a footprint happening in the last few years?
That is an excellent question, Sandeep, and I realize that this is a question that may be raised. You have raised it upfront, and I think there's no sort of easy answer to this because it's a bit of everything. But let me just try and answer it in this way: that around 2013, 2014, India accepted the whole Indo-Pacific construct. It's very interesting what happened in the years leading up to that point, which is that there was this debate within the Indian establishment of why we should subscribe to something that the Americans and the Japanese were pushing. This was their geopolitical agenda. It didn't suit our needs, our interests. And the logic really was at that point, which is compelling, is that India needed to see Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific now as an extension of its primary theater of interest and responsibility. And that happened because a lot of Indian trade was actually flowing through the east-west sea lanes, the Malacca Straits, etc. Almost 50 to 55% trade. At this moment, also nearly 60 traverses east. Either it goes to the east or it's coming from the east. So for trade reasons, for our energy interests, there was I talk about Sakhalin, about Indian stakes in the Vietnamese EEZ. We needed to have some presence in that region. The second logic for India to look east in a military way was that India wanted to sit on the high table. As I mentioned this year, we saw ourselves very much as a growing, responsible power. But were we willing to take up the responsibility, in a sense, to take a stand on the contentious issues of the day? One of them being freedom of navigation. What the Chinese coercion at that point, around that time, was again quite high in Southeast Asia. And the thinking was that we needed to take a stand because this was a way of showing solidarity with our partners in that region. So for the sake of solidarity, we needed to do some exercises in that region, send some military force in that region. We were extremely acutely aware of the fact that the Chinese would not appreciate Indian interference in what was happening in those waters. And so we steered clear of the disputed areas. We still continue to steer clear of those areas, but it was important for us to be there. The third reason is exactly what you stated. It was for balance with China. If the Chinese were beginning to make their presence felt in the Indian Ocean, at that time there was the whole talk of Hambantota, and Chinese submarine had appeared in Colombo and Bay of Bengal. The Chinese at that time were beginning to build a naval base, a submarine base in Bangladesh that they recently completed. So if the Chinese were in our neighborhood, we should apply some pressure to and be in China's literal neighborhood, and that's what we did. Now, over a period of time, what's happened is that we realized that there's a certain kind and level of cooperation that ASEAN is comfortable with. I don't think ASEAN would appreciate very much if Indian ships went and directly challenged the Chinese. And therefore, Indian thinking is that we will simply be in support of our partners. As I said, showing solidarity, but also advancing their interests. ASEAN centrality is about ASEAN making the decisions about what is the extent and level of cooperation that it needs from India or from its other partners. And here's the thing about India, and someone very interestingly remarked sometime probably in a conference sometime back, that the thing about Indian cooperation is it comes with no baggage. There's no strings attached. It's not like we want greater political alignment with any of those countries in a way that we can counter our adversaries. We don't want such partnerships that are zero sum. And that makes India a very safe partner. So I would think there are all of these elements. I don't think that India still considers itself as a major player in the South China Sea, and I don't see a time in the near future when it ever will. But it's definitely a stakeholder. It's definitely has interest in those waters. There was a proposal some time back for India to be part of the Malacca Straits Patrol from Singapore, which the other countries were not comfortable with. Indonesia and Malaysia are not very willing to accept countries that don't have the South China Sea as its littoral. And so India's happy to do that. There is no heartburn that we were not invited to join the MSP. That's where I would leave it.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I had another China-related question, but before that, because you raised this, and I think that this is an interesting point to me, make that India does a lot in West Asia. It is anti-piracy operations, maintains permanent naval presence. It is now getting very much involved in East Africa, where it is doing capacity building. And of course, in the Indian Ocean islands, it can do a lot. And it was very interesting that you said that ASEAN, because ASEAN itself, there are a lot of maritime power here as well, and there is a certain degree of limit to what kind of role they have, and they have very specific ideas of what kind of roles that they want from, participation they want from external actors, and there is limit to that because of ASEAN centrality and various ways of thinking about it. But is one of the ways of also thinking about India's engagement with various geographies is also that the host nations or whatever those geographies are in that politically and geopolitically, there's only so much you can do in some places as compared to say others, right? In East Africa, where the countries are much weaker, you can do much more capacity building because it's cheap to do it. Or in say Indian Ocean islands, where the geopolitical balance is very different, right? Like India is a much bigger power. It can do much more because it has much more freer hand in crafting its role, as opposed to in ASEAN, where it has to be, maneuver a very strict, very previously laid out, like, guidelines of what you can and cannot do. Do you think that makes sense?
No, that's a very nuanced observation, and I would agree with you. Look, maritime strategy really, honestly, has a horses for courses approach. Context is everything, and every nation has a different expectation from its partner. So if you look at the small island nations in recent years, what we've seen is that they are fiercely autonomous, and they have their own sense of their place on the globe. They don't think they are inferior to anyone, and why would they be? And they don't like being treated like little brother. So a lot of these countries uh, are somewhat skeptical about proposals in which you build some infrastructure for them, and then you either use that infrastructure as a strategic outpost, or perhaps you use that for your own surveillance missions, etc. In a sense, they don't want to be pawns on somebody else's geopolitical chessboard. And that approach is something that India's got to keep track of, because really what happens is that good maritime strategy is about appreciating your constraints in terms of capacity and also your red lines in terms of the limits of what you can do politically and otherwise. With Southeast Asia, there is a great synergy, in the sense that Southeast Asia realizes that there's a lot of trust with India, and they are willing to deepen the partnership with India, but up to a point, because ASEAN also has a certain consensus within themselves, and the impression that India is doing too much with one particular nation, and that might be construed by China as anti-China activity, does not sit very well with the remaining members. So, as I said, there are nuances to what you can do militarily in every region. But broadly, I would agree with you, yes, that when it comes to capacity building, finance does play a very important role. There's certain kinds of equipment that India cannot provide. There's certain kind of equipment that India does provide. I would say that one of the reasons why India is such a big provider of defense goods in this region now is because the other suppliers somehow are not very reliable, or at least there's a perception that they are not reliable. For instance, the Americans, when they give their systems, the E-35s, they've got these end use monitoring programs in which they want to be able to determine what kind of activities you are doing with the equipment that they've supplied. Nobody wants those kinds of constraints to be applied by the supplier. Then there is China, with whom these countries are involved there's differences. There's these whole disputes in the South China Sea, and Chinese coercion is not appreciated. So I think there's a certain level of skepticism regarding China. And Russia is very distracted with its war in Ukraine, and it's not giving very good, high quality goods, defense goods. So I think the only option is to go to India. That's what I'd say.
Yeah. Well, although, I mean, now the new players like Korea and all these are also coming up very fast.
Agreed.
But you're right that the traditional suppliers for Southeast Asia, which has historically been spoiled for choice in terms of weapon supply, it is becoming much more complicated. So my China question that I wanted to ask, and it is sort of unfair because it's a difficult question. I think there's no easy answer to it. But I think that very rightly you said that there's the development aspect of Chinese expansion in the Indian Ocean region, right? Because it is becoming more of a development partner for a lot of littoral countries, and also the fact that it has a massive naval modernization project, and it can spend much more because it is a much bigger economy, right? So on both those fronts, it is in some way can outspend India to a great degree, right? And this combined with the fact that at least for the time being, it seems that the relationship between India and China is not going to reset back to the 2000s level, right? So the sense of rivalry does exist. So given that, what can India do to compensate for the weaknesses that it has? How does it then compensate for the balance that?
I had mentioned in my remarks that the Chinese are very sophisticated actors because they read the room very, very well. And when I say room, I don't literally mean room. I mean the entire theater of operation very well. The Chinese actually have two sets of strategies for the South China Sea, one for South China Sea, the other for the Indian Ocean. In the South China Sea, they realized that this is a rim theater or a littoral for them, and they need to use what they call a full spectrum dominance strategy. Use all the tools at your disposal to dominate that space, and that they do through their navy, but also through the militia operations. In the Indian Ocean, they have what some have described as the incremental stakeholdership model. Gradually, you make inroads. You come here with your Belt and Road proposal, you build infrastructure, you help out these countries with development, build bridges, etc., pipelines, and then you politically begin to encash all the good work that you've done in the region. This strategy has a very minimal component of military dominance or military power projection. So I think India's challenge is that if we simply look at it through the naval military lens, there's very little we can do. Because if Bangladesh has given away one project, the SEZ Mongla, to China, no amount of military power projection will help Bangladesh change its mind. And so the Chinese don't actually need to dominate this region by using military force. They could do so. That option is always there. They have the military wherewithal. They have the aircraft carriers and submarines and the destroyers and frigates to do so. But they don't need to. Here they are positioning themselves as security partners, development providers. They are willing to provide the security goods as they call. So it is a competitor for India now in terms of being a security provider in the region or a development provider in the region. And so, how India can compensate really is not through military power projection. That's just to protect your stakes in the region, to protect your theater of influence and operations. What we need to do is work with our partners in other domains. Like there's been this whole talk on critical minerals, on technology, on connectivity, uh, uh, these are the proposals, blue economy projects. That's what Chinese are a big contributor to the blue economy projects in the Bay of Bengal, as well as the wider Indian Ocean and Africa, etc. So the competition is not just in terms of how much hard security we can provide, it's also of how much development we can do. And I think we've got to explore those options rather than just look at it through a military prism.
Um, the other one question I wanted to just raise before going into Q&A is about the US as a strategic partner to India. One in the maritime domain, how is that part playing out, or is it playing out at all? Especially in the last 1 year with the rocky relationship that the two countries have had. How do you see that partnership going in the future? How does it? Which direction do you think it is going?
Look, I think you're right to suggest that the US-India uh, relationship since Trump took over, at least after Operation Sindoor, has been rocky, to put it mildly. There have been at some places, some moments, those differences have really come out into the open. But I think that in a military sense, we continue to engage with the US. I think India and the US have a very deep maritime relationship. A lot of our equipment continues to come from the US. And under the Quad, there was recently the Quad foreign ministers meeting. We've upgraded, as I was mentioning, the IPMDA, the Maritime Domain Awareness, to the surveillance cooperation agreement. And we continue to do the Malabar exercises with one of the most sophisticated and broad, wide-ranging exercises with Japan, Australia, and the US. So I think the military relationship hasn't been affected so much. But I think until that the political synergy does not come back, there's going to be limits to what India will do with the US. I think the fact that the US recently changed the name of the Indo-Pacific Command to the Pacific Command really is a sign that the US somewhere was somewhat disenchanted with both with the idea of playing a role in Indian Ocean security and also how much India was contributing to Indo-Pacific security. I think the US wants greater guarantees from India that it will play a bigger role in the South China Sea, in a Taiwan crisis, etc. That's what the Trump administration wants from India. At least that's the sense here, which is not going to happen because that is the last thing that India will get itself entangled in. And even otherwise, I think Mr. Trump is highly personal in the way he looks at political relations, and the fact that we did not endorse what he saw as his primary role in sorting out the crisis between India and Pakistan 2 years back means that he continues to hold a grudge against us. So the politics of this is a bit complicated and a bit murky. But I don't think the operational relationship has been affected. I think we have terrific relations with them. We do have some reservations with a few things. For example, Diego Garcia. I don't think India is still comfortable with using that military base, and the expectation that we will provide some such military facility to the US were a conflict in the region to break out. I think we're uncomfortable with that proposition. But other than that, I think we have a very good working relationship with the US Navy.
There's a comment by Mr. Yasser Rizvi. This is the minor point of correction for Mr. Singh. China's investment port projects is very limited. He's talking about, I think, a Bangladeshi port process. The Paira port is close to non-functional. The investment in Mongla is just for the 110-acre economic zone and not Pongla port itself. Ultimately, India's geographic connectivity with Bangladesh and the higher potential for Bangladeshi export and import cargo to use India's deep sea port will outweigh any Chinese influence, in my opinion. And I think that also leads to a larger point about, there is a lot of, in media especially, there's a lot of this excitement about China-India rivalry and all the smaller South Asian neighbors, India's South Asian neighbors. But I think that although we've been talking about that for the last 10 years, 15 years now, it has seemed that in the end, the geographical proximity, the historical history of the relationship, the deep economic ties have sort of, countered a lot of this Chinese investment blitz that has come into a lot of the, or how do you read that? I mean, because it seems like India is not as much as a back foot as media makes it out to be.
Well, I'd say that this is really a subjective assessment of what China is really doing in Bay of Bengal countries. One way to look at it, and Mr. Rizvi will write that just the quantum of investment may not be very big, but I can only tell you how India is looking at what's happening in the region. This is a very Indian perspective about what China is doing in a space that India considered literally its own, political backyard, even though that's a bad way to put it. Look at the fact that the Mongla Port SEZ initially was earmarked for India, but there were, and Mr. Rizvi would know perhaps that there were issues in the way the Indian bureaucracy was approaching that project. I'm not faulting Bangladesh. No one faults Bangladesh. They're entitled to work in their national interest, whatever suits them best. And they shifted this to China because the perception is that the Chinese are efficient when it comes to delivery. And there is no doubting the fact that the Chinese have a very efficient system of delivery. I am not going to quibble about how much money they are going to invest in that. Look at the management of the Tista water, in which again China has now been included. So again, from an Indian perspective, this is extremely worrying. The fact that in Cox's Bazar they have a submarine base, the BNS Sheikh Hasina, which was constructed by the Chinese. You could argue that there are no Chinese there, and I mean, this happens all the time. There's always a foreign collaborator in these things, but that's all very good, and no one is accusing Bangladesh of selling out to China. But all I'm saying is that from an Indian lens, this looks very worrying. This looks like there is a creeping expansion of Chinese presence in these waters. And you are right. Matabari, the port is with Japan. Japan is putting in a lot of money there. Paira and Chattogram, some of the expansion that's happening there is with Chinese help. It's not that Bangladesh is not reaching out to India. There's been a robust political outreach in recent years, given all our differences, whatever happened in the time of Sheikh Hasina, etc. But that does not mean that this has assuaged our concerns about Chinese presence in this region. That's the point that I'm making, that from an Indian lens, it looks a bit suspicious and worrying.
But on that, just a follow up. Do you think that and I know that you basically, to a certain degree, independent analyst, but also trying to understand the New Delhi's thinking in all of this. Do you think that New Delhi, in some ways, has the threat perception of China a little tuned, a little too high in terms of that every investment that happens in the region is viewed as, because a lot of people argue that, a lot of the BRI and all is essentially just development money that is coming in. But India views all of it as essentially, in some ways, with a zero-sum view of that any gain of China is a loss for India. Is that so? I suppose I'm asking that, do you think that that is a little too much in terms of the threat perception, or do you think that it is, to a certain degree, fair assessment of the geopolitical situation as it exists today?
I think every analyst would have a different answer for this. I think what's really happening is that it's not like India has any animus or animosity against China. And I say this because despite whatever happened at on the border in 2020 in Galwan, the fact is that now we are willing to accept Chinese investments. Minister Jaishankar met with Wang Yi, their foreign minister, the Chinese foreign minister, recently, and it was a very cordial meeting. And we discussed about normalizing trade. I would just tell your participants that the Nathula Pass, which was closed ever since those clashes happened, was only last week or a couple of days back opened. So there's a trade happening across the border. We have a very cordial discussion at the RIC and the BRICS, etc. So it's not like we are at daggers drawn with each other. I think the problem is a misinterpretation of the rivalry, if you put it like that. The point is that India and China have certain red lines over what's acceptable and what's not. For instance, the Chinese would not like Indian ships to be coming and entering the South China Sea in disputed areas and doing exercises there. That's a red line. We are happy to work with you, but don't do stuff that we are not that crosses the level of our tolerance. Similarly, India's you could call it. I don't want to use the expression because I'm really against using such blanket, vocabulary, which is that the Monroe Doctrine. They say that India has got this thing that in Asia, or particularly in South Asia, nothing happens unless New Delhi does not see it as favorable to its own interests. I'm not going to go so far, but I'm saying that India does have a baseline level of expectation from the neighborhood. And it is that any activity that could be perceived as anti-India activity should be avoided. So this is not just about Bangladesh. It's also about, look at Sri Lanka. Look at the fact that there was a time when a lot of these Chinese survey vessels and submarines, one of the submarines actually docked in Colombo. And it may not have been a deployment that was meant to threaten India. I think Sri Lanka, as a sovereign country, it is entitled to open up its ports for whichever ship it wants to. But India was not very comfortable with that, and we conveyed it to, and New Delhi conveyed it to Colombo, that such kind of activity in India's neighborhood is not quite acceptable. So we have red lines about what China can do and what China should not do, which should not be construed as a blanket enmity. It's not like it's a full-scale, war with China. We realize that China is a really, really big power. They are going to be perhaps one of the two leading powers just in about a decade from now. And so, as Mr. Jaishankar puts it, that they have a very big market, and a lot of our trade happens with China. And I don't want to antagonize someone with whom we have such deep economic ties. So I would put it is a bit of gray. It is a bit of black and white.
No, I think also thinking about it more in terms of red lines and not just in a very zero-sum mentality is a very helpful way of thinking about it. I'll read out a question by my colleague, Ivan. Thank you, Commander Singh. Greetings from Ivan Liderev. You suggested that China and even Pakistan's growing presence in Bay of Bengal might constrain India's power projection in South China Sea and the Pacific. How much can India actually do to counter this presence? And if it can't, which seems likely, how would this growing weakness affect India's strategic maritime thinking and allocation of resources? This is along the lines of something we were already discussing.
It's hard for me to answer this question. I tell you why. This is informed speculation on my part. I'm not saying that the Pakistanis are going to send a submarine tomorrow to the Bay of Bengal, but the fact that they said that now we are looking at the Bay of Bengal, they're trying to send India a message that we might, in the near future, perhaps in the distant future, send some of our assets into this region, and that might complicate your calculus. They're just trying to let us know about it. Now, should we consider this to be a threat, or should we consider this to be just advance warning? Well, that's entirely up to the Indian strategic establishment about how it looks at this. I think that China and Pakistan will at some stage be sending their ships in these waters, not as a way to threaten India, but perhaps as a way uh, to collaborate with Bangladesh. We know for a fact that Bangladesh has opened up a new line of communication with Islamabad. They're talking in many areas. They're even defense trade, etc. There's some of their the JF-17s, etc. Bangladesh has shown some interest in buying those planes. So I think that in the future there's going to be at least some Pakistani assets that might be sent over to the Bay of Bengal for some port calls. Should India be objecting to that? We could perhaps deploy some of our warships in the region as a deterrent or as a counter message to Pakistan. But Pakistan, strictly speaking, legally, by the UNCLOS, is actually entitled to send its ships through the Bay of Bengal. That is not that is an Indian territorial water or Indian EEZ. There's any country is entitled to send water. So I don't think that this is really a military question about what we should do. What we are expected to do is to have greater domain awareness in this region, to at least be able to see what is happening, how many ships entered, whether there was a submarine sent, where did it spend most of its time, what are the research vessels and the survey vessels in the region, what are they trying to do, what sort of surveillance activities happening. Just keep yourself well informed about that. And I suppose Pakistan would react exactly the same way if Indian assets were found in the northern Arabian Sea.
Okay. Another question I have, Japan is beginning to play a larger naval role in the South China Sea and even the Indian Ocean. This obviously offers opportunities for partnership with India, including in shipbuilding and the development of naval technologies, as revealed by the recent Modi Takeichi meeting. However, there might be risk of excessive entanglement in the growing China-Japan rivalry and potential conflicts. What are the risks in your opinion? How far would India be willing to go and take these risks?
Well, I think that to begin, let me just say that the Japanese are cautious players in the sense that uh, Japan, whilst it's very willing to help its partners in Southeast Asia, refrains from uh, any such activity that would outwardly or overtly threaten China. So I think that this conception that India and Japan could come together to somehow pose a threat to China in the South China Sea, I think would be is a bit stretched or far-fetched because the Japanese have in the past also, even in the Indian Ocean, refrained from acting in a way that would be deemed as being too forward-leaning militarily. And I would here I would cite the example of the fact that a couple of years ago there was some talk of Japan helping India with setting a chain of underwater sensors. That was a Japanese proposal that they were willing to help India with this. It was undersea wall of sensors, the SOSOS it's called. But that ultimately didn't come through. One, because India was perhaps not willing to go ahead with that proposal at that time. We now have an indigenous proposal for the DRDO to do so. But India at that time was hopeful that perhaps with Japan, like with the US, we will have a robust naval engagement program, which did not quite materialize. And India is perfectly okay with it in the sense that we understand that or New Delhi understands that there's a few things that Japan does very well, but a few things that it refrains from doing. So I think that the Japanese this is a very intelligent strategy by Japan to build the capacity of its neighbors because that's what they want. This is exactly what ASEAN wants, and a lot of countries in the South China Sea require is capacity building. I think these countries themselves would be uncomfortable with Japanese warships and submarines, floating around in the South China Sea. I don't think that's going to happen. With India, I think we have a very close partnership in the Northeast. We do so many projects together in Africa and in other places in in Bay of Bengal, we have a lot of cooperation in Bangladesh also. So I think with Japan on the economic side, there's going to be a lot of cooperation, and on the military technical side, there will be some collaboration. Perhaps not so much in terms of what we do together bilaterally. And I'm not discounting the fact that there is Malabar, and also we do also a Japan-India bilateral exercise. But again, we do it in safe spaces. We don't do it in spaces where that are disputed.
We had another question about the importance of Japan for India's strategic calculus by Kaveri Jain, but I think you already answered that. We have a question here by Captain Anoop Sharma. Could you please share your views on how maritime initiatives like Indian Ocean Ship Sagar and its recent deployment to Southeast Asia in 2026 align with India's maritime strategy for collaborative maritime security in the region? This is again something that you have sort of touched on.
Yeah, look, the Sagar initiative is significant, significant though symbolic, uh, because for the first time we actually have a ship in which there's crew drawn from other countries, and that in a sense shows that there is a greater appreciation of interoperability, of being able to work together, develop common protocols, procedures, and and watch each other work and in close spaces. So whilst it may not really be a strategic initiative, Sagar is not meant to threaten anyone. It's just a symbol of cooperation. And this has happened. It has happened in Africa also. This ship was deployed in Africa. It's been deployed in Southeast Asia. It's a significant sign that, or a signal that India is serious about its Mahasagar initiative. I think at this moment, India also wants to leverage uh, maritime maritime power to expand its reach and to be a leader of the global south. So iOS Sagar is one of those initiatives that helps India do that. It is a way of projecting India's Mahasagar doctrine, or elucidating the fundamentals of that Mahasagar doctrine to its neighbors and to its partners. I would point out that India has something called as the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, the IPOI, and a lot of the Southeast Asian countries, in particular Singapore, is involved very much in the IPOI. And Sagar and now Mahasagar also looks at ways in which we can have cooperation with all of these partners in the Pacific. So therefore, I would say that such initiatives, you could call them in a way, these are ship rider programs, but they send a very important message of confidence in your partner, and that's, I think, critical as far as maritime operations are concerned.
So just a couple more questions, and then we'll let you go. But because this is a very interesting discussion. One question, and I suppose it's a little bit of a crude way of putting it, but in terms of, I wanted to ask you about how to think about military balance in Indian Ocean. Especially, I mean, you very rightly pointed out that in Indian Ocean, China is more of a cooperative, constructive actor using development as the means to, extend its influence. It doesn't have to necessarily directly militarily compete. But if we were to think in terms of military balance or military competition of some sort, there is the enormous geographical advantage that India has because it's at the center of Indian Ocean, right? Like as opposed to China or even United States, for which this is a second or third ocean, right? And they have to come through a very long line with a very long supply line. So how do you, I mean, how do we think about that balance of the geographical advantage? Like how much geographical advantage does it give India? Is it something that can be surmounted, or by throwing in much more resources or getting bases, or I don't know, is there a strategy to overcome that geographical advantage that India has? And do you think that that balance is shifting?
You mean the geographical disadvantage, or you mean the advantage that India?
The Indian geographical advantage, the fact that it's at the center of Indian Ocean, it can do
Mm.
whatever it wants in the ocean, as opposed to say China, which has to come all the way from from its coast and go through Malacca Straits and then come here into the Indian Ocean. So
Yeah.
within the Indian Ocean, the geographical advantage that India has, how does that how does that fit into the balance, military balance, and the way we think about military balance? That can it be overcome by a country like China, a potential adversary which has to come from outside the ocean? or it can't be overcome at all?
Look, the India does have a significant geographical advantage. You were right. We have 7,500, kilometers of coastline, and that's a significant amount. But you see, what happens is in maritime strategy is that uh, what geographical advantage you have is of is your perception of what you can do in the region. As far as your partners are concerned, they are simply interested in knowing from you how much you can collaboratively deliver in their theater of interest. For instance, if India were doing operations with, say, the Maldives, uh, uh, and partnerships again are critical here. To the Maldives, it makes no difference about how long your coastline is, and what's your theater advantage there. It's simply looking at that. How sincere are you on delivering on whatever it is that you're promising to do with the Maldives? China has a massive geographical advantage, one could argue. But China realizes that it has logistical constraints when it deploys in the Indian Ocean region. It does not have the bases, etc. It's now developing, of course, the logistical wherewithal, but that advantage really has no meaning. A lot of the countries that China would like to engage with in the Indian Ocean don't think of partnership in terms of how big China is, or how much of geographical expanse the country has, what coastline it has. It simply has to do with what can China do for me, what's in it for me. And that this, I think, is one of the real reasons why India shifted from that formulation of net security provider to preferred security partner and first responder in crisis. Because the whole idea that we are big, we have too many advantages, we can give you what you don't have, is somehow considered as somewhat patronizing by your partner states, your smaller partner states, and they don't want to engage with someone who comes with the presumption that only they have what it takes to deliver security in the region. That context was the context in 2008 was different, because bear in mind, when the tsunami happened, very few countries really had the capability to deliver security, and India saw itself as one of those two. So it said, a few years after that, it said, okay, I'm going to be a provider of security. And when the piracy incidents began to take place in around 2013 2014, again India had the reach to be able to provide security. So it saw itself in those terms. But along the way, your partners didn't like it. So you're right in suggesting we have a big geographical advantage in the Indian Ocean, and perhaps China recognizes that advantage. I don't think China will ever intend to or plan to militarily threaten India in India's neighborhood. But what India should really be concerned about is not what China thinks about it. It should be concerned about what our partners think about us. How can we deliver more security? How can we be a force for good in the region? Can we do more with them collaboratively? What is our interoperability? How much are we doing together collaboratively to develop the economy? The Blue Economy project is exactly this. That's why a number of these countries uh, want India's help, because they, not for military purposes, for the purposes of generating jobs and employment, etc. So that's really the maritime focus.
Uh, Last question about Indo-Pacific. So, as you rightly pointed out, Indo-Pacific was in New Delhi seen as something of an American concept, and there was a lot of debate at some point about whether we should adopt it or not. But then Indo-Pacific did become, a primary way of talking about, if not thinking about, at least talking about strategy in India. And it seems like in the last 6 months, a lot of people in India who were talking about Indo-Pacific all along are now beginning to question it again, right? And a lot of it has to do with the rocky relationship with the United States. But again, the issue of Indo-Pacific has come under question in New Delhi itself. Uh, how do we think about India's commitment to Indo-Pacific as a concept as opposed to, say, Indian Ocean? In the past, when it was talking about Indo-Pacific a lot, as opposed to now and going in the future, how do you think about how India will approach this question of Indo-Pacific going in the future?
I think India remains committed to the idea of the Indo-Pacific. But I will take you back to what Prime Minister Modi had said in the Shangri-La conference, Shangri-La dialogue in, I think, 2017, was that this is not a clique. that is meant to counter China or contain China. I think that fundamental um, understanding or conception of the Indo-Pacific remains. I think India will continue to be cautious in the way that it projects its power and its capability in the Western Pacific. Uh, One, because it realizes that everything that you do, even with good intentions, may not be construed so by both your partners and your adversaries. And so there, when you're operating in the far seas, you have to be very careful about sensitivities. As I said, both of your friends and your foes. So when we say the Indo-Pacific, we essentially mean that India's primary area of responsibility continues to be the Indian Ocean, where we will play a large, robust role in delivering security. In the Pacific, we will be a partner for whichever country wants to work with us. We will be happy to build your capacity, but we care about the geopolitical balance. It is said about sea power that the reason sea power is so important is that it gives you leverage, both in strategy and statecraft. I think that is the thought that underlies India's Indo-Pacific approach, at least in the military maritime domain or in the naval domain, which is that we want to have sea power. We want to be able to use it in constructive ways, be a force for good. But we want to first be able to protect our own interests in our neighborhood and the interests of our partners. As far as the far seas are concerned, meaning Western Pacific, for that matter, even the far Eastern Pacific, the small island Pacific states, we want to simply be able to do what we are expected to do by those partners. There should be no illusions about how much we can do or what India intends to get in return for what it is doing in that region. I think I will just uh, let it be there. That's what I can tell you.
Thank you so much. This was, every time I read your work or I talk to you, I always come away with so much more understanding than I had before. And this is no different. This was a fantastic conversation. Thank you very much. Thank you to the audience for sticking around and for joining us. And join us again next month for another iteration of India and Asia. We'll be sending out details of that soon. Once again, thank you very much, Commander. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandeep. The pleasure was entirely mine. And thank you for some wonderful questions, particularly the intervention from Mr. Rizvi. And I completely agree with what he had to say. It's just that I just have a different perception. That's all. But thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye.